Today we're going to be installing the Volquartsen Accurizing Kit in the Ruger Mark IV. The installation of this kit will give you a much lighter, crisper trigger pull and should help you shoot the pistol much more accurately. Let's take a look at what this is going to involve. First, we're going to replace the factory trigger, plunger, and spring with a new Volquartsen trigger, plunger, and spring. And you notice that the new Volquartsen trigger has both a pre-travel and over-travel screw that'll help you make some fine adjustments and give you a trigger pull that's best for you. We're also going to be replacing the factory sear with a brand new Volquartsen sear and the factory hammer, bushing, and strut with a new Volquartsen hammer, bushing, and strut. And you'll notice that in taking out the factory hammer, we're also taking out the mag disconnect here. We won't be replacing that, so this will result in no mag disconnect on your pistol. Your pistol will fire without a magazine installed. Finally, we're going to be removing a part that we may not be replacing. It's up to you. This part is located right about here underneath the right grip panel, and it is a mag ejector. I think the thinking on Ruger's part was that this mag disconnect complicates the ejection of the magazines a little bit, and they would just put in this little extra booster to help kick the mags out. Now I think you'll find that when we remove the mag disconnect, the mags will eject just fine. I've chosen to leave this out of my pistol. You may choose to put it back in. When we take the pistol apart, you'll find out that it goes into a recess right about here underneath this grip panel, and it may very well fall out on its own when you remove the grip panel. Alright, before we get started, there are some tools that Volquartsen recommends you have standing by, and I'll recommend a few more that I think you should probably have. First, a 1/16 and 3/32 hex key, which Volquartsen conveniently provides for us as part of the kit. A small hammer or mallet. I'm just using this small brass gunsmithing hammer. That's all we're going to need. We're not going to be doing any heavy-duty pounding. Of course, a small pair of needle nose pliers always comes in handy to help you grab some of those tiny parts that we're going to be dealing with and hold them in place. A 1/8 inch punch. I'm just going to use this brass punch. A benchtop or workshop flashlight. As you know, there's some dark recesses in the pistol frames, and sometimes you can't really see what you're doing, and a small flashlight standing by really helps you make sure those parts are aligned. And of course, dealing with small parts, you're going to drop some every once in a while, so it's a good idea to have a magnetic pickup handy. Fish a spring or something out of the dark recesses of that frame. And once you do fish it out, along with the other parts, a magnetic parts tray is really handy. We're going to be dealing once again with a lot of small screws and springs and other small parts that want to scatter to all corners of the workshop, so magnetic parts tray is always handy. At one point early in the installation, we're going to have to drop the hammer, and of course until we remove that mag disconnect, you're going to need a magazine to do that, so have an empty magazine standing by. And finally, because every gunsmithing operation seems to require 3 or 4 hands, it's nice to have a benchtop vise. If you have one, and make sure you have some padded jaw covers for it to protect the frame of the pistol, but a vise will come in handy during some of the operations we're about to do. Before we begin the installation, there's some prep work we have to do. I've already done all of it on this particular pistol. First and foremost, of course, we have to clear the pistol, so make sure the mag is removed, and then check and double check the chamber to make sure there's no round left up there. When you've completely satisfied yourself that the pistol is clear, you can go ahead and separate the upper from the frame. Of course, that's a pretty simple operation on the Mark IV here. I'm sure everyone knows how to do that. Next, we're going to remove both grip panels, and recall that when we do that, over here on the right side, we're going to expose this recess where the mag ejector sits. Now, I've already removed the mag ejector from this pistol. It may have fallen out of yours already. If it hasn't, this would probably be a pretty good time to remove the mag ejector from that recess right there. Then over on the left side, we want to remove the slide stop, or the no slide on the Mark IV. We want to remove the bolt stop. The bolt stop pivots on that tiny little screw right there, and it's inserted underneath that stud. To get it off, we're just going to lift it off the screw and then back it off of the stud. Let's see if I can do that without dropping it. So once again, lifting it off the screw and then just sliding it backwards off the stud. Now, we probably should take this opportunity to familiarize ourselves with some of the components that we're going to be dealing with. Remember, after the installation, we're going to have to put this pistol back together, so it's probably a good idea to know ahead of time how some of these parts go back in. First, let's take a look at the mainspring housing here, and in particular, right in there, how the hammer strut has to be inserted in the top of the mainspring housing. Might be a little bit easier to see from the other side. So once again, hammer strut is going to be inserted in the top of the mainspring housing. Let me see if I can get some light on that for you. There we go. You might be able to see that in there. So the hammer strut is compressing the mainspring down into the housing there. Just forward of the mainspring housing is the sear. That's this part right here. Once again, from the left side, the sear right in front of the mainspring housing. And then take a look at the way this leg of the sear spring lies alongside the mainspring housing. This is the long leg of the sear spring. When we reassemble the pistol, we want to make sure that's not up here in the mag well. It needs to be back here, just laying along the left side of the mainspring housing. Now there's one more thing we have to do before we begin the installation, and that is drop the hammer. And since we haven't removed the mag disconnect yet, that's going to require a magazine. So let's insert a magazine, take the safety off, protect the hammer from snapping forward, pull the trigger, just let the hammer ease forward, and then we can remove the magazine. Alright, the first step in the installation is removing both safety levers, the safety, the hammer, and the mag disconnect. The first step is to unscrew this screw right here, which holds the right side safety lever on. Now, when you first remove this screw, it may be very tight. I'll give you a little clue. I've pre-loosened mine, but it was pretty tight when I started it. So take this screw out. And you'll have to lift off the right side safety lever. And once again, this is pretty tight. If you have to use some gentle persuasion to pry it off, I like to use a synthetic pry bar so we won't mar the finish. So just get it loose and then lift the right side safety lever off and out of the way. Now, the hammer pivots on this shaft, which is attached to the left side safety lever. So we're going to do this in 3 steps. We're going to push the shaft and the safety lever almost all the way through, but we're going to leave them just barely inserted so that the safety, which is this part, does not fall out. Then we'll be able to lift the hammer and the mag disconnect out of the frame, and this is the stage where you'll be glad you decocked the hammer first, otherwise it will want to come out under quite a bit of force. So once the hammer and the mag disconnect are pulled out of the top of the frame, then we'll completely pull the shaft out and remove the safety. So let's try that now, see if I can do it without too much difficulty here. I'm just going to use the 1/8 inch or the 3/32 Allen wrench to shove that shaft out, or to get it started anyway. So notice we're going to leave it partially inserted. Now when you get this far, there's a spring and detent on the left side safety lever. You want to make sure that detent doesn't go flying off, so make sure you retain the spring and the detent there. Notice how the hammer is getting a little loose. keep pushing, but leave it inserted just enough to secure the safety. Let's see if we can pull this hammer out yet. Not quite. Okay, the hammer just came loose. So there's the hammer along with the mag disconnect. We're going to set those aside. And now the trigger bar is now loose. You can rotate that up and out of the way if you want. I'm going to kind of protect the safety to keep it from flying or dropping with my thumb while I remove the rest of the shaft. And now I can lift the safety out. The next step in the operation is to remove the sear and sear spring. They're held in place by this pin right here. Now, to tell you the truth, the pin may want to fall out. Mine fell out on its own when I first did this disassembly, so I actually have it held in now with a piece of tape just so I can show you where it is, but it should fall out on its own. And there it is, releasing the sear and the sear spring. The next step is to remove the trigger assembly held in place by this pin right here. Now when we remove the assembly, that's going to involve removing the hold open stop, which is right here, the trigger, this spring and pin that fell out when we opened the trigger bar. Let me put that back so you can see where it goes. But the pin and spring are in the top of the trigger there, and they'll just fall out on their own, so make sure you don't lose track of them. And then also coming out will be the trigger bar and this pin retainer spring right here. When the pin comes out, you'll see a groove in it. This spring wraps into that groove and just helps retain the spring. So that spring is going to come out. When we reassemble the pistol, we want to make sure that that retainer spring is peeking out of that little tiny hole in the frame. Now, unlike the sear pin, this pin may require some gentle persuasion. For that, I'm going to use my benchtop hockey puck. You all have a benchtop hockey puck, right? I kind of prefer it sometimes to the bench block. Using the 1/8 inch punch, we're just going to gently tap that out. Let's see if that'll go the rest of the way on its own. Going to require just a little bit more. So the bolt stop is now released. If I can pull this pin out. Now there is the groove in the pin that the retainer spring wraps into. So when the pin comes out, that's going to release the spring. You just saw the spring release. The trigger bar and the trigger. And let's see if I can get that spring out of there. And there's the retainer spring. So that completes the removal of all the factory parts that we're going to take out. Now we can start installing some Volquartsen parts. Now we're entering what I like to call the building a ship in a bottle phase of the installation. We're going to be inserting the sear and the sear spring on the sear pivot pin right in here. Now recall that the sear spring has a long leg and a short leg. The long leg, as we recall, is going to go into the recess adjacent to the mainspring housing, and just along the left side of the mainspring housing. We're going to avoid getting it in the mag well, which is just forward of that. The spring also has a loop. The loop is going to be facing forward, and the short leg of the spring is going to be just about standing straight up. After that, we're going to line up the sear on the same pin as the spring. The sear is going to be oriented with the barrel or cylinder shaped edge forward and this curved part down and to the rear. This flatter part is going to be facing up. And the sear and the sear spring are going to be oriented like this. Notice that the short leg of the spring is just in front of this leg of this flat part of the sear. They'll be oriented on the pin just like that. Let's see if I can get them in. So I'm going to grab the short leg of the spring. Make sure that long leg is going down adjacent to the mainspring housing. Get this pin started and just see if I can slip it over, or slip the spring over the pin. So the pin is started, and we've got it through the spring. I'm going to let those sit there for a second. Whoops, don't want to lose it. Now I'm going to grasp the sear with the needle nose pliers in the correct orientation. Slide it in there next to the spring and capture it with the pin. Once that's done, I can remove the pliers and push the pin the rest of the way through. Now you may have to nudge the sear just a tiny bit to get the pin to line up with the hole on the opposite side, and there it is. Now this pin is fairly loose. It's not too snug in there and it can fall out, so I'm going to temporarily secure it with just a small piece of tape on either side. Now to test and make sure you have it in the correct orientation, the sear should be spring loaded at this point. If we push it forward, we should meet spring resistance and it should be forced to the rear by the sear spring. Looks like we got it correct. Alright, next we're going to be installing the trigger bar, and the slide stop on a pin through these holes right up here in the forward part of the frame. Now first, recall that we have this retainer spring that has to go in. The retainer spring has a loop in the front which is going to be facing down. The bottom of the loop will be facing down, and this hook will be protruding from the right side of the frame. So we'll put the hook through the tiny little hole on the right side of the frame, twist it, and then rotate the spring down into position. Next we'll insert the pin. Now make sure the groove on the pin is to the right. We're going to be inserting it from the right, and you may have to depress that spring slightly to get the pin over it. So there's the pin over the top of the spring and being retained by a little bit of friction from the spring. Now let's take a look at the trigger. The trigger is going to go in next. There are two holes in the trigger. This lower hole is for the pin. This upper hole is where the shaft of the trigger bar goes. This pin at the tip of the trigger bar is going to go through that hole at the very top of the trigger. Now you could use the trigger bar then to dangle the trigger into the trigger guard, grasp it with your left hand, line it up with the pin, and insert the pin through it. Now don't insert it all the way because we still have to leave room over here on the left side for the slide stop. Okay, here's the bolt stop. Here's the bolt stop. Remember, the bolt stop has this stud that has to protrude out the left side of the frame. So we're going to insert that into the slot there so that it's protruding. Rotate the rest of the stop down, and it's going to meet some resistance from a tiny little spring that's buried in the front of the frame there. Now you may have to push the slide stop down against spring tension in order to get that pin inserted the rest of the way. There it goes. Now this pin isn't quite all the way through. Remember, we're going to have to give it just a tiny bit of persuasion to get the loop, the spring, into that detent that we looked at. And there it is. So the pin is all the way through. The spring has captured that detent and the pin is locked in place. Now we can rotate the trigger bar up, drop the spring in the top of the trigger and then insert the plunger in the spring. If we've done everything correctly, when we depress the trigger bar, once again there will be a little bit of spring tension forcing it back up. Now it's time to install reinstall the safety and install the new Volquartsen hammer. Let's take a look at the safety for a second. Notice the dots are in the rear, and of course they have to face outboard, red on top, white on bottom. And in the front of the safety, you'll notice this notch. That notch is going to capture the top of the sear and hold it forward under spring pressure. Now, to pull the sear forward under that spring pressure, I find it handy to capture it with the 3/32 Allen wrench, push it forward under spring pressure, and then hold it while I drop the safety in on top of it. So at this point, the safety is inserted and it has engaged the top of the sear. However, the holes on the left side are probably not lined up. The hole in the safety is probably not perfectly lined up with the hole in the frame. That's a very, very tight tolerance. So I'm going to insert the shaft of the left safety lever in 3 steps. First, I'm going to manipulate the safety with the Allen wrench over here to get the holes approximately lined up and capture them with the Allen wrench. Next, I'm going to insert the 1/8 inch punch from the right side and capture everything, making sure the holes are lined up, and that, of course, that punch goes all the way through both holes in the frame. Finally, I'm going to take the left side safety and pushing it through, I'm going to displace the punch. There we go. So now the safety, the shaft on the safety is holding everything in place, but it's just barely inserted because, of course, we have to leave room to drop the hammer in. Also notice that I have removed the detent and the spring because you'll probably lose them during this operation if you don't take them out at this point. We'll install them as we rotate the safety down and push it all the way through. Now let's take a look at the new Volquartsen hammer. Of course, this is the front face of the hammer. Hammer strut hangs down in the rear. And we're going to insert the Volquartsen bushing through the smaller hole in the bottom of the hammer through the right side. Now we're going to rotate the trigger bar down, insert the bushing through the slot in the trigger bar, and then drop that whole assembly into the frame, making sure that the top of the strut goes on top of the mainspring. And it did. Now I'm going to depress everything until I can get the shaft of the safety through that hole in the hammer. I'm sorry, my finger's going to block some of this. There we go. And now we have to push the shaft the rest of the way through. Once again, you may find it easy to line everything up with that 1/8 inch punch, and now is the time, of course, to reinsert the detent and the spring. So I'm going to rotate everything down, line everything up, and gently displace that punch with the safety detent. It may take a little bit, yeah, we have to manipulate just a little bit more. The shaft is actually hollow because there's a screw that goes in there, and you can manipulate it with the 1/8 inch punch if you need to. There we go. And of course the detent is still in place. Alright, it's time to put the finishing touches on the reassembly. We'll start off on the right side with the right side safety thumb piece. Now notice that because of these tiny little studs on either side of the shaft and the corresponding slots in the hole here, it should be impossible to put this thing on in the wrong position. So since the safety is off now, this should go on in the off position, and sure enough, fits just fine. And we'll go ahead and see if we can reinsert the screw without dropping it. And just give it a little bit of a snug up. Now next, if you wanted to reinstall your mag ejector, this would be the time to do it. Remember, it goes in that slot right there. I think you'll find out though that with this installation, the mags are going to eject just fine without it. I'm going to leave it off mine. And finally, we'll go ahead and reinsert the reinstall the right side grip panel. Okay, moving over to the left side now. First thing we need to do is reinstall that bolt stop thumb piece, and recall that the fork is going to be inserted underneath that stud, and then the hole will be slipped over the screw back here, which serves as the pivot hole. There we go. And now we can put on the left side grip panel. The grip panel is going to have to slide underneath the thumb piece there and just behind the mag release. There we go. And a couple more screws. And now it's time to finally reinstall the upper. To get the upper on, we're going to have to make sure that the hammer is cocked. It is, and the safety is on. And we'll take a second just to make sure that the upper is aligned just right before we try to snap it into place. There we go. There's our pistol reassembled. Let's move on to some function checks. And keep in mind that we haven't installed a mag yet, so we're also going to be checking the removal of the mag disconnect. So first off, with the safety on, we should not get a hammer drop. And we don't. Safety off, we should see a hammer drop. Oh, and that's a very nice trigger pull. I think you're going to be very happy with that. And of course, with no mag installed, the hammer dropped just fine. Let's insert a magazine and try everything all over again. So mag installed. Cocked once again. The bolt hold open works well. Release the bolt. Safety on. No trigger, or no hammer drop. Safety off. And once again, very nice trigger pull, and the hammer does drop. And now, I promised you that the mags were going to eject just fine without that mag ejector installed. Let's take a look. It fairly shoots out of there. So now, before I close, I just want to remind you to follow the Volquartsen instructions on the adjustment of the over travel screw and the reset screw. The instructions are very good, but just heed their warnings that if you overdo it on the over travel screw, the gun may not fire, or you may get inconsistent firing. If you overdo it on the reset screw, or on the reset screw, you may not get a reset when you release the trigger. Well, that's it for our video on the installation of the Volquartsen Accurizing Kit and the Ruger Mark IV. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider giving that the like button a poke, and thanks ever so much for watching.